Hi, my name's Mark and welcome to the channel. Today I'm sitting down with you to talk about swatching with Colorwork. We're specifically looking at an example for a sea glass sweater or another sea glass pattern from wool and pine. If you're interested in swatching along with me or seeing some tips of how to get started for your next project, then stick around. Let's get into it. If you're not already familiar with what's going on here on the channel, I'm leading a make-along, a knit or crochet along for any of the sea glass patterns from the company Wool and Pine. I've got more information about this in the description box below, so feel free to check it out. Or you might be here at this video because you're already planning to participate in the make-along. If so, you've probably already signed up. If not, that's linked in the description box below as well, and you've probably received an email from me. We're going to have some Zoom gatherings for swatching to talk about color ideas. Those are happening today, Wednesday, when this video is posted, and also this coming Sunday. So those dates are listed below, and if you've signed up, you'll receive an email about those events. So in front of me, I've got a few swatches. If you've been on the channel with me, then you've probably already seen these. The colorful swatches here were two sets of colors that I tried to arrange and swatch for my sweater, my cardigan that I will be making during the make-along. So you'll see a couple of different things, different colors. This was sort of the second set of colors that I put together with the help of friends. And then I swatched them in different orders, sometimes with the colors repeating for 2 rows at a time, and other arrangements where they change more rapidly. The first set of colors that I started with is swatched here. I've got the colors in rainbow order on this portion of the swatch, and then I separated it with a textured row, and then put them in a different order here to figure out what I liked best. We can answer a lot of our own questions by swatching. If we're not sure about how colors should be arranged, what order they should be in, or even if it's the right fiber content for the project we're considering, we can figure out whether or not we like those arrangements and those decisions through swatching. Taking the time to put these colors in order and taking the time to actually knit the texture that will exist in the finished garment gives me a lot of information. Whether or not I like the density of it, if I think the fabric is too dense, too loose, if I'm happy with the needle size that I'm working on, and of course it allows me to then measure the fabric and start to figure out if I'm close to reaching gauge or not. Now for a gauge swatch, a true gauge swatch, typically you're looking to make a larger piece of fabric, and depending on the material you're using and the stitch pattern you're using, you might treat the swatch differently. You might hang it vertically, you might add some weight to it to really see what your finished garment is going to look like. For this project, swatching is all about arranging colors. It's a chance for me to practice the stitch combination and get my colors in front of me to figure out whether or not I'm ready to dive into the project. So that's what we're talking about today. I have another swatch in front of me. This is for the sea glass sweater that I'm currently making, just to make sure that I was on top of the pattern before jumping into a make-along with all of you. And this sweater has a color combination that was selected by my friend Megan, and the sweater will be for Megan at the end. So in this situation, we have a carry-through color. We have the light gray that's used in every row, and then a set of 5 contrast colors. In my sort of rainbow collection that I'll do for my own sweater, I don't have a carry-through. The colors change constantly. And maybe I'll change my mind, maybe right before we cast on October 1st, I'll add in a carry-through color. I really like what the carry-through color does. It balances everything out and it makes it a little easier for my eyes to trace the colors. This is a bit random, but the project I think is meant to be a bit random. You could use a lot of scraps. You could use advent color kits. You could use mini skeins, or you can purchase new colors, or a combination of the two. So I don't quite know. I think I'll be happy with my sweater no matter what happens, but it's been interesting to spend a lot of time with Megan's where I do have a carry-through color. And I'm tempted to see if there's a carry-through color that would fit my jewel tones. We'll see. I'll decide by October 1st for our cast on. Okay, moving ahead with things, I wanted to answer a couple of questions people have asked about swatching for the sea glass. So we're going to put together just some scrap colors I have out of a worsted weight wool. I'm doing this so it shows up a little bit better on camera than using a lighter weight wool. However, you should use whatever weight you're planning to use for your sweater, and you should use this as a chance to test the actual colors that you'd like to use. So I'm definitely going to use this white, and I think I'll start with the blue because I think both will show up well on camera. You'll see the contrast well. I have more blue than I have white, so I'll cast on with the blue, and I'll use that to set up just a couple of rows in garter stitch. I'll knit both sides for maybe 3 rows to give me a little edge to my swatch. Now, because this swatch is not truly for taking the perfect measurement, rather it's for figuring out color combination, I don't have to make it to be a certain size. I'm going to cast on 30 stitches across, and I think that will give me enough space to practice my stitch. All right, now that I have 30 stitches on the needles, I'm going to knit across just to give myself a foundation for this swatch. I'll probably knit 3 rows here. And if you're brand new watching me, or if you haven't paid attention to it before, you'll see that I'm knitting in the Continental style. I hold the yarn in my left hand, and I don't do a lot to tension it, but it runs over the top of my index finger. I keep both sides of my work pretty close to the tips of my needle so that I can work, I think, at a decent pace. I'm not the fastest knitter in the world, but I do like to move along, and I like the rhythm of knitting. Whatever I'm working on, I really like to pay attention to the rhythm of making my stitches evenly and feeling the movement of the fiber work through my hands and the stitches move from one needle to the next and see that little bit of fabric grow each time. Okay, that's 1 row across, so I'm just going to turn my work and go back the other way, again, just to give myself a little foundation for this swatch. Now, one question a lot of people have about swatches is, what do you do when you're done with the swatch? Well, usually the goal of a swatch is to consider your gauge, to figure out if the yarn you're using and the needle or hook size will get you to the right measurements, so whatever you're making fits in the end or reaches the approximate size you're imagining. So typically you're working a certain number of stitches across, and then you want to work that until you've reached a square. After that, it's best to go ahead and block that, or treat the swatch however you would treat the final object you're making. So if you don't ever block your finished objects, then don't block your swatch. But if you do block your garments or whatever it is you're making, block the swatch. You can block it the same way you would block whatever you're making. So I typically wet block things. I soak them, submerge them in water and wool wash, and then I press that water out and let it dry completely. So if that's what I'm doing with my sweater, that's what I'll do with my swatch to try to get the most accurate measurement possible. Then, once that's dry, I'll measure it several times. I'll use a flat ruler, I'll use a flexible tape measure. I have a couple of swatch gauge measuring tools, things that are already, a square window that you set over it, a magnifying glass sort of tool that you can press against your work. Whatever you have will work as long as you're consistent. So it's best, once you've finished your swatch, to take measurements multiple times, write them all down, make sure you're getting the same answer each time, and you could also have somebody else come in and measure your gauge swatch. At the local yarn shop here in Ohio, we have people come in all the time to have their gauge swatch double checked, which I think is a great idea. So if you have a local shop, if you have a friend who crafts, if you have anybody who's going to be able to look at what you've made and determine where the stitches are, have them measure it, just so you have a second opinion. Once you've done all of that, make sure you've written down your measurements, and then at that point, if it's not important for you to keep the swatch, maybe you're short on fiber and you'll need every yard, every foot to finish whatever your project is, then you could pull the swatch out and reuse the fiber. If you can afford to use that fiber and sacrifice it for the rest of your project, then I would say keep the swatch. Some people keep their swatches in notebooks organized. Some people put them on a cork board on the wall. You could keep them in a basket, anywhere, but it could be helpful in the future to come back and measure it during the project, to come back and look at it to help you discern other questions you might have about using that fiber with that specific needle or hook. Okay, so now I'm ready to set up for my color work. So I'm going to be using two colors here. In the sea glass sweater or the sea glass hat, cowl, any of the projects, you're using two colors in a row. Even if your project has 20 colors total, if you're using minis or scraps, you're never using more than two colors in one row. It's very similar to Fair Isle knitting in that sense. The other thing that will always happen is that you're working one by one. So one stitch of one color, then one stitch of the next, back to the first, then to the second. So it's A, B, A, B, A, alternating the whole way. So I'll take the tail of my second color and I'll just squeeze it with the other. And I'm going to show you how I hold my yarn, how I like to work two colors with Continental knitting. I'm going to take the yarns first and tension them however you normally like to tension. If that's around your pinky, if that's through a couple of fingers, go for it. And then I take one color over my index finger and the next color over my middle finger. They're both tensioned together around my pinky, but one will go over my index, the next over my middle. Once I have that set, I do the same thing about staying close to my work, and then I'll start alternating. So there's my A. Now I'm ready for my first B, and I'll show you this in a little bit more detail once I get both of these secured. Okay, now that they're in, let's slow it down and I'll show you exactly what movements I'm using. I go into my first stitch, and then like normal, I yarn over and pull through with my leading color. Neither of these are really leading right now. They're both going to become sort of embedded into the pattern, but sometimes you do have a main color and a contrast color. So for this sake, I'm thinking of the blue as color A and the white as color B. So now for my color B, I'll go into the next stitch, and it's just on my middle finger. So I'm just going to dip or sort of hinge my wrist so that my needle tip is closer to that color. I could do the first, but I want to reach past it and pull through, pull up a loop with my contrast color. And that's it. So I'll go back to color A. That's my normal knitting. And then for color B, I'm just rocking my hand to go past color A and yarn over with that color B. And that's it. I'll zoom in and talk through this again. I've had some people specifically ask in comments here, a couple people asked over on Patreon, so I wanted to make sure to cover what I do with my Continental style. After this, I'll show what you can do with your English style or what you can do with a combination of the two. I should say there are a million ways to go about doing this. None of the ways are the right way. None of the ways are the wrong way. It's most important that you find something that's comfortable for you and that you can do consistently. So I'll do my color A. That's my normal knit. And now for color B, I'll just rock and yarn over with the white. Because this is one by one color work, I don't have to pay too much attention to how tight my floats are, that is, the strands running behind. If I were knitting Fair Isle or stranded color work where I have 3 stitches or more in one color before I use the next, I would need to be spreading my work out more often and paying closer attention to how much tension I'm putting on each strand so that the work doesn't pucker. The nice thing about 1x1 color work is that the tension, as long as you're being consistent, will define the fabric you're making. So if I pick up one of my swatches, as long as I stay consistent with the way I'm holding my yarn and pulling up my stitches, that's going to create the size of the stitches and the density of the fabric. It's not like we're knitting a portion of this garment in stockinette stitch and then later having color work that might differ gauge-wise. It's all 1x1 color work. So don't worry about that. Just try to find what feels comfortable for holding 2 strands and reaching them when it's time to do those stitches. So I'll show myself in close-up here picking up the yarn. So let's say I put the project down, it's time to work again. Both strands are together. I'll run them around my pinky just once, and then I'll take consistently each time I pick it up, whatever color I've called my main will go over my pointer finger, and the next color will go over my middle finger. You can flip-flop those. If you're using different colors for every row, then you don't have a main color, so just choose which one goes over your pointer, which one goes over your middle. And now here, I start with my main color, and then I just rock to pull up for my second. I like this because I have both colors separated. I know a lot of people like to have both colors over the same finger, which would look something like this. And to do that, you're just dipping and then you separate them when you need to use them, which I find a little harder, especially if you're using a sticky wool. They might cling to each other and start to come through the stitches or mess up the tension a little bit. So this is not my favorite method, but I'm also not good at it, so I'm not demonstrating that well. There are people that do that and can demonstrate it beautifully because it's the most comfortable for them. So what I do again, tension the yarn however you like to do it. I send one over my pointer, one over my middle, and that helps me command them a bit more regularly, and it also allows me to work on my knitting without looking at it. I could look up and then more easily feel if I'm picking up the yarn from my pointer finger or my middle finger, because they're pretty far apart. Okay, so that's one row completed in my 1x1 color work. It doesn't look like much right now, but as long as you kept your pattern of every other color, then you're doing it right. The next thing to point out is how to work your swatch so it will actually mimic the fabric that you'll make with any of the sea glass patterns. The sea glass patterns all have instructions for how to work them where you're always on the right side. You're never turning the work and purling. So for something like the cardigan, it's not made in the round. So what they have you do is slide your work. I'll zoom out for this. For the cardigan, they have you slide your work from one needle to the other, but then your yarn is on the wrong side. So one way to swatch like this when you're doing stranded color work or anything that would later be in the round is to take the length of yarn needed, pull it across, sort of anchor it with your hand, and then start working. And that leaves you with strands going behind the work. After I made my first swatching video, I think it was Richard who pointed out a brilliant way that I could do this without having all the strands behind. And that is to take a much longer portion of yarn and pull it across. And then instead of working with the live yarn, flip that around and work with the large loop you've pulled. So I don't know if that makes sense. Let me show it again. Instead of pulling this across and working with the live yarn that's attached to the balls, which would leave us this piece on the back, which is fine. Instead of doing that, I can take about triple the length of my project. There's 1, 2, 3. So that's 3 times the length, 3 times the width, I guess, of my swatch. And then instead of working from the live yarn that's attached to the balls, I'm going to work from the long piece that I've taken. So I'll flip this around, anchor it, and I'm going to knit with this piece here. So I'm going to go into my first stitch. It's a little fiddly because it's not connected to anything. And then I'll do the same thing where I separate my colors the way I like to hold them. And this time, going across, I need to make sure that I'm alternating the colors, meaning if I go into a white stitch, I knit with blue. If I go into a blue stitch, I knit with white. We're creating a checkerboard here, making sure you're not creating columns of color, but alternating them. So here I go across, and hopefully we will have estimated the right length, and you'll see the magic of how we get from one side to the other without having such a long piece of yarn running behind the swatch. Okay, we made it across. You can see that my work gets really bunched up because this is 1x1 color work and not stranded color work. I don't have to worry so much about the bunching because it's going to work itself out evenly. If I were doing stranded color work, I would not be bunching out my work because then I'd probably be pulling my floats a little too tight. So now you can see a little bit more of what our pattern will actually look like. And let's look at the magic of that strand we pulled across. We're just left with a very small loop. So my estimation of 3 times the width worked out well. So if you're trying this method at home, estimate for yourself, start with about 3 times the width of your swatch and see if that's the right amount of fiber for you. If it's way too much, you can cut back. If it's not enough, you could take another length. And I think it's nicer. So thank you, Richard. I think it's a beautiful way to swatch so that I'm not left with all of the strands running behind the work, like I have here. It's fine that they're there, but it does make the swatch a bit more clunky. So here, I did it the other way, where I'm just left with the loops on one side, which makes the rest of the swatch pretty easy to examine. It made it much easier to block, and I think it's just a nice, tidy way to do it, where you're not wasting as much fiber. So let's go across again. This time, when I slide my work back to the other side of the needles, you'll notice that our working yarn is in the right place. Because the last row we did, we borrowed the yarn from the other side. Now it's ended up in the right place. So if you use this method, you only have to estimate and pull that extra length every other row, which is another added bonus. So I would do the same thing. I'll start this row using the method I like. So I'm keeping consistently blue over my first finger, white over my next. And now, if I'm in a white stitch, I'll knit blue. If I'm in a blue stitch, I'll knit white. And this is the whole gist of 1x1 color work. So use your swatch to stack your colors, figure out if you like the order, and give yourself a chance to practice what technique feels best, what hold, in the event that you're not as familiar with color work. I know a lot of people have said this will be their first color work project. Okay, so now that I've done several stitches in the method that feels best to me, I'll show you a combination method. For this combination method, I'll separate the yarn, keeping the blue on my right, the white on the left. And now, the white yarn will be tensioned in my left hand, and I'll knit with it in a continental style. The blue yarn will be tensioned in my right hand, and I'll knit with it in an English style. I'm very bad at English knitting, so be patient with me. I'll go into the stitch, yarn over, pull my stitch through, and there's my blue stitch. Next is my continental. Next is my English. then my Continental, then back to English, and that's the gist of it. You may really throw the yarn. So here are a couple stitches throwing that, showing that. And it does the same thing. I get the same effect of my 1x1 color work without the yarn getting stacked on itself or tangled up. So again, I'm not good at this way. Be patient with me as I demonstrate. This may feel best for you. Oh, and it's very fiddly here at the edge because again, these stitches aren't anchored to anything. I can tighten those up once I've reached the end of my row. I can just pull snug on those hanging pieces just so the edge of my swatch isn't so unruly. So there's an example of the combination style. Now you might notice as I do this, when I change my technique, the size of my stitches changes. So it's important that you use this swatching time to figure out what hold is most comfortable and makes most sense to you, and then practice with that. Make sure you do it for enough time that you can get a good measurement so that whatever you're making turns out to be the size you want, the size you expect. All right, the last thing I'll show is if I were to use English for both strands. We started with both strands held Continental, then the combination of one Continental, one English. So now let's put them both on the right side to knit English style. We'll slide our swatch back to the other side of our needles, and this time the working yarn is not in the right place, so we'll need to take our estimate of 3 times the width. So I pulled across 1, 2, 3. So I think that's about the length of fiber I need. So I'll pinch them both on the left side, and now I have a long length to work with. It feels very awkward for me because I want to knit it Continental style. I'm going to start my first few stitches Continental just to anchor the yarn because I don't knit English style in real life, I never have, and I'm not good at it, so I can't really demonstrate it well, but for the sake of the video, I want to make sure you know the option is there. Okay, so now I'll take both strands in my right hand and I'll try to knit with them in the English style. If it's your first time doing color work, you may find that the most comfortable thing to do is to pick up the color you're working with, then drop it and pick up the next color. And there's nothing wrong with that. If it feels comfortable to hold them both and throw them or work in a continental fashion, then it might feel faster. It might feel like there's less work involved. But if you typically pick up and drop your yarn stitch by stitch, then there's nothing wrong with doing that for this color work as well. Okay, so that's a few stitches there, demonstrated English style, and it's all the same idea. We're just working one color then the next. I'm going to finish this row Continental just because that's the main point of this video, to answer how I like to hold the fiber so that it stays untangled and evenly tensioned. So again, it's just my rocking motion to get to my middle finger or to work my usual stitch from my index finger. It doesn't look like too much, but you can start to see the pattern. And again, the further I go, the more structure this will have, the more the pattern will reveal itself, and it achieves two things for us. Really three, but two big ones. One, it achieves the test of what color order we like. Two, it lets us practice the technique, making sure we like whatever hold we choose to use, and we get comfortable using our two colors in alternation. The third big bonus is that at the end of this process, we have something to measure. That's going to help us figure out what size of sweater, what size of hat that we want to make for this make-along. All right, I think that's everything I wanted to cover for today. Just a quick explanation of how to swatch for this project and a couple of different ways to go about holding and managing your yarn. If you're joining me for the make-along, you should be receiving emails from me at this point. If not, stand by. I'm checking the signups daily and then sending out those new batches of emails. So thank you for being here. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Again, this is just me answering the question of how I find the best way to do these things. I'm not an expert. I know there are many people out there better and more knowledgeable than I am, but I wanted to share my perspective and answer a couple questions. So thanks for spending this time with me. I'm always happy that you choose to watch whatever I put up. I've got a lot of travel videos coming, a lot of things from the trip we just took coming your way. So thanks for being part of this community. Thanks for choosing to spend the time with me. As always, happy knitting, happy crocheting, happy crafting to you, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Bye.